In New York, one may find for the asking an Italian, a German, a French, African, Spanish, Bohemian, Russian, Scandinavian, Jewish, and Chinese colony. The one thing you should vainly ask for is a distinctively American community. Jacob Riis.
There started to awake in me a fevered passion to become part of America. I read newspapers and magazines and books like a fanatic. I read out loud billboards, posters, signs of all kinds, and every word, every name opened new vistas to me. I was becoming saturated with Americanism.
Between 1880 and 1914, 23 million foreigners poured into the United States, the largest infusion of immigrants in American history. At the end of the Civil War, 1 out of every 2 Americans still worked on a farm. By 1920, only 1 of 4 did. Immigrants fueled the nation's astounding industrial boom. From coal mines to car factories, they provided the labor that would help make the United States the greatest economic power on earth. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. So read the inscription on the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor that welcomed millions of newcomers to America. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. The United States offered hope and opportunity to millions of people from around the world. Here on America's shores, though, poverty and prejudice continued to plague them. Critics charged that the huddled masses were too wretched, too foreign to become real Americans. But they did become real Americans, and in the process, they transformed the nation forever. In trolleys and tenements, in ballparks and movie theaters, they helped forge a new urban culture. This is the story of how diverse immigrants became Americans, while America itself was becoming something new.
We've always been a nation of immigrants, but the immigrants have come in waves, and each wave has brought people from different parts of the old world. So we began the process over again of getting along with new kinds of people, both adapting to them and they adapting to those who'd already been here.
So until the late 19th century, most immigrants who came were of the same kind of Anglo-Saxon stock from Western Europe as the earlier settlers in this country. What distinguishes the new immigration, beginning with about 1870, is that now we are seeing people coming from parts of the world where they had not come before.
In Europe, industrial revolutions were replacing household production and farming. So more and more people left their small farms for cities like London, Hamburg, and Amsterdam. And millions continued on to the new United States, where wages were higher, food was more plentiful, and land was easier to buy. Industrialization then seized Southern and Eastern Europe, countries like Italy, Poland, Hungary, and Russia. Here, too, factories displaced small craftsmen, and cash crops displaced small farmers. So they, too, migrated to the United States.
The new immigrants came for many of the familiar reasons: for economic opportunity, for greater freedom, political freedom, and religious freedom, because Europe was at war with itself for much of the 19th century. And these punishing wars were another reason for leaving the old world and coming to what would be a more peaceful America.
In the early 1900s, 80% of America's immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe, including 3 million Italians, 2 million Jews, and 1 million Poles. Between 1898 and 1919, over 3 times as many immigrants came from these new countries as from the old ones. England, Ireland, and Germany. Before the Civil War, immigrants had spread across the countryside to farms and villages, as well as towns and cities. As America industrialized, however, most of the new immigrants moved to America's cities. Immigrants and their children made up 87% of Chicago, 84% of Detroit, 80% of New York, and 78% of San Francisco. Roughly 40% of these birds of passage went back to their homeland. For some ethnic groups, the figure was as high as 60%.
Many of these people who came never intended to stay in the United States for very long. They were here and intended to make money and go back and buy a little farm that they wouldn't have been able to buy if they hadn't created capital by coming to the United States.
Children and their parents spent long hours at dangerous and often monotonous occupations.
Not only were they the ones who found themselves working for low wages and long hours in factories, but they also came into a country which did not open their arms and welcome them. They found great prejudice and even bitterness on their arrival.
Employers were often successful in dividing workers along ethnic and racial lines.
Well, the relation between unions and immigrants was very complicated because many large American unions had been started by immigrants. A good example is the American Federation of Labor, whose president, Samuel Gompers, was a Jewish immigrant from England, a cigar worker. And yet, as money and work tightened in the United States, these same unions very often started to try to keep immigrants out of the United States because immigrants represented job competition.
We sympathize with the oppressed of the old world, but we are, as a country, in the position of any other asylum whose dormitories are full up. The American labor movement is strictly American. The American Federationist, 1897.
Other immigrants were victimized by the agents who found them work in America. Italians often had to pay a large part of their wage to their padrone, or patron, who provided room and board as well as a job.
We came to Brooklyn, to a wooden house in Adams Street that was full of Italians from Naples. Bartolo had a room on the 3rd floor, and there were 15 men in the room. Most of them worked at digging the sewer. They paid him about 1/4 of their wages. Then he charged them for board, and he bought the clothes for them too. So they got a little money after all.
With so little money, immigrants clustered together in squalid urban neighborhoods.
There were no bathrooms in the buildings. There was no running water in the buildings, so you had to carry water from the basement of the building up until 2, 3, or 4 floors of steps to get into your own apartment.
With names like Little Italy, Polish Hill, and Chinatown, these ghettos were ridden with poverty, filth, disease, and sometimes even death.
The hall is dark, and you might stumble over the children pitching pennies back there. The sinks and toilets are in the hallway, that all tenants may have access, and all be poisoned alike by their summer stenches. Listen, that short hacking cough, that tiny helpless wail, what do they mean? A child is dying with measles. With half a chance it might have lived, but it had none. Jacob Reese.
In Pittsburgh, 55,000 people, mostly immigrants, contracted typhoid from the poisoned water supply. In Baltimore, they ate oysters from polluted rivers and developed deadly stomach diseases. And in New York, home to the largest number of immigrants, 1/3 of Italian babies did not live to see their first birthday.
All of the time I hear about the grand city of New York. I learned that New York is twice, 3, 4, 10 times bigger than Italian city. I think I'm going to a great city, to a grander country, to a better world, and my heart developed a big admiration for America. I arrive in New York. You think I find here my idea? Alessandro Da Luca.
I looked out into the alley below and saw pale-faced children scrambling in the gutter. There is America, cried my heart. Ansia Jezirska.
To survive in America, immigrants depended on each other. The first and most important resource was family. Immigrants often traveled to America alone, but they usually moved in with a relative who had come earlier. 3 or even 4 generations lived together, sharing salaries and expenses. The next level of support was the ethnic community.
Within their neighborhoods, they got more together, and they maintained their traditions and their values. That was an important resource for them, and they did that largely on an informal basis. But they also did it more formally by forming associations and organizations to protest against discrimination, and also, in certain instances, to go to employers as an organized group and see that doors were open to them.
So you might belong to a benefit society where every week you paid in a little bit of money, and then if the breadwinner in the family was hurt on the job, the benefit society would pay back some money to help the family get through. Because remember, this is a time before any kind of workman's compensation, before unemployment insurance, before any of that safety net that we are aware of today.
Ethnic newspapers, written in native tongues, provided ties to the old country as they helped immigrants adjust to the new. Ethnic grocery stores offered the tastes of home.
Another way they could go around is actually to change the politics of the situation. We have many immigrant groups who decide to do their best to take over local political organizations. So the Irish are very, very good at this in many American cities in the Northeast. And that will provide many opportunities for Irishmen when you can start electing Irish local politicians who can provide jobs, who can provide all sorts of services to Irish immigrant communities.
In the words of New York City political boss George Washington Plunkett in 1905,
"If there's a fire in 9th, 10th, or 11th Avenue, any hour of the day or night, I'm usually there as soon as the fire engines. If a family is burned out, I buy clothes for them and fix them up till they get things running again. It's philanthropy, but it's politics too. Mighty good politics. Who can tell how many votes one of these fires brings me? The poor are the most grateful people in the world, and let me tell you, they have more friends in their neighborhoods than the rich have in theirs."
our dollar bills say e pluribus unum, from the many, one. But how could so many diverse peoples become one? In 1909, Jewish playwright Israel Zangwill offered his own answer. Their cultural differences would melt away.
There she lies, the great melting pot. Listen, can't you hear the roaring and the bubbling? Oh, what a stirring and seething! Celt and Latin, Slav and Teuton, Greek and Syrian, black and yellow, how the great alchemist melts and fuses them with his purging flame. Here shall they all unite to build the Republic of Man and the Kingdom of God.
Zangwill, an immigrant himself, thought this melting process would happen naturally. But other Americans were not so sure. Immigrants from countries like Italy, Poland, and China were so different, they said, that special efforts would be needed to Americanize them. Employers led the way, designing programs to make their immigrant workers more American. Special classes helped the workers learn English and tried to promote thriftiness, cleanliness, and punctuality.
Public schools were obviously the most important institution that the immigrant family confronted because children were required by law to go to school, and here the language was taught, the culture was taught, and it was a very important force for Americanizing these children.
Education was free. That subject my father had written about repeatedly as comprising his chief hope for us children. The essence of American opportunity, the treasure that no thief could touch, not even misfortune or poverty. It was the one thing that he was able to promise us when he sent for us. Sure, safer than bread or shelter. No application made, no questions asked, no examinations, rulings, exclusions, no machinations, no fees. The door stood open for every one of us.
By 1908, over half of the students in urban public schools had a father who was born abroad. In New York City, the fraction was almost 3/4. Educators used the public schools to provide immigrant children a crash course in American values and habits.
These people tend to settle in groups or settlements and to set up here their national manners, customs, and observances. Our task is to break up these groups or settlements, to assimilate these people as part of our American race, and to implant in their children, so far as can be done, the Anglo-Saxon conception of righteousness, law, and order. Elwood Coverley, 1909.
Insulted by the notion that their cultures were inferior, immigrant parents often sent their children to parochial schools. In Chicago, for example, over half of the Polish children attended a Catholic school.
I think it's wrong to assume that these children were, as a result of going to school, ready to drop the cultural traditions and language and so forth that they experienced at home, and in many cases they had memories of from their own early lives. And so I think what happens is that these children learn to live in both worlds, and that they mediate the message of the school.
But many immigrant youths tried to Americanize as quickly as possible. In millions of immigrant households, children and parents clashed.
My big, pretty daughter is not the girl I knew. I talk to her in Yiddish, and she replies in English. She doesn't like to have me light the Sabbath candles. When I light the candles, she blows them out. She makes fun of me and her father. She calls us greenhorns. Once, I saw her standing on the stoop with a boy. So I went up to her and asked her when she would come up. She did not even reply because I had called her by her Jewish name. But I cannot call her by her new name.
Often immigrant children, that is children of immigrants who had been born in the United States, were very embarrassed of the so-called greenhorn ways that their parents had. Their parents' accents or even their inability to speak English, the food that they cook, the clothes they wear. And so children would come back from school and they would say, I don't want to eat your sandwich, or I don't want to wear your clothes, or I don't want to speak your language because that's a reminder that I'm different.
Immigrant children often received their new names in public schools. In one New York school, Esther Oberrein became Esther O'Brien. In another, Giuseppe Vagnati became Mike Jones. When a teacher changed Leonardo Coviello's name to Leonard Covello, which was easier for her to pronounce, his parents complained. But Leonard, a new American, sided with the teacher.
What happened to the E in Coviello? You don't change your family name.
You don't understand.
Will you stop saying that? What is there to understand? Now that you've become Americanized, you understand everything, and I understand nothing.
Many Native Americans believed that the new wave of immigrants could never be Americanized. As more and more newcomers poured into the country, some began calling for restrictions on their entry.
If you go to the West Coast, the Chinese who arrive, starting in the 1840s, meet a very hostile reception. And sometimes often a hostile reception from American workers who think the Chinese are taking their jobs or depressing the wages of other people. And there's tremendous hostility.
In 1876, white manual laborers formed the California Workingmen's Party, dedicated to ridding the state of what it called the Yellow Peril.
3 years later, California held a whites-only referendum on excluding the Chinese. Final vote, 150,000 for exclusion, 900 against. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred further entry of Chinese laborers for 10 years. Urban poverty and disease, coupled with the labor conflicts of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, also fueled calls for the exclusion of Poles, Jews, Russians, and others considered to be lesser immigrants. Spouting a new brand of so-called scientific racism, critics charged that these groups were diluting the genetic stock of Anglo-Saxon America.
From the rate at which immigrants are increasing, it is obvious that our very lifeblood is at stake. There is a great hazard in the mongrelizing of distinctly unrelated races. Michael F. Geyer, 1916.
Scientific racism was an attempt to give the aura or the authority of science to the racist idea that there was a rung or a hierarchy of peoples, that the Anglo-Saxon people were superior, and it went down from there. Other peoples, including Slavs, Jews, blacks, were somewhat lower on the ladder.
Unlike the Chinese, Southern and Eastern Europeans were never excluded outright from America's shores. In the 1920s, however, Congress would enact new restrictions that sought to return America to its ethnic balance of the 1890s, before the huge influx of Italians, Jews, Slavs, and Poles. But there was no turning back. For in America's cities, the new immigrants had already created a new urban culture. Streaming into America's cities, immigrants must have been bewildered by the variety of large-scale amusements they encountered. Vaudeville, Nickelodeons, amusement parks, baseball games, newspapers, all new and all within the budget of most newcomers. But they quickly embraced these commercial entertainments, which helped immigrants adjust to the pace and problems of city life. In the end, both the immigrants and the cities they inhabited were transformed forever.
Children were often attracted to leisure activities that were outside of the ethnic community, that were more American. And for young working women, for example, in the early 20th century, the dance hall was a great attraction, or the new amusement park. And so for many of these younger people, they were not content with the social life that the immigrant community offered.
On the stage, immigrants saw images and symbols of their own lives. Magician Harry Houdini, who billed himself as the world-famous self-liberator, was a crowd favorite.
Houdini is a good example. Houdini was, of course, a master of escape, which was something that all the immigrants had done in one way or another. They had escaped from one environment and transformed themselves. So when they watched Houdini, what they saw was a kind of symbolic reenactment of their own experience.
With the advent of motion pictures, immigrants could also see their lives transposed on the screen.
Silent movies. There's no need to understand English to enjoy what's taking place. And you think about many of the old Keystone Cop films or many of the silent shorts, and what they do is they mock authority figures. They make fun of police, they make fun of politicians, of businessmen. They really reflect the working class and poor and immigrants' sort of difficult or contradictory relationship to these people in positions of authority.
Baseball is the very symbol, the outward and visible expression of the drive and push and rush and struggle of the raging, tearing, booming 19th century. Mark Twain.
America's newest citizens also helped make baseball its national pastime. In ballparks across the country, immigrants witnessed speed, timing, and efficiency, the very qualities that the new industrial economy demanded. And just like the economy, baseball emphasized strict rules and regulations. To win in baseball, or in America, you had to play by the rules. But in America, the rules did not always apply equally. In 1867, the National Association of Baseball Players barred black players in teams. Later, blacks would form their own baseball leagues. So baseball reflected the racial divisions that immigrants found in the city. It also reflected their own success in America.
So many of the stars were immigrants or from immigrant communities. They had last names like LaJoy. The immigrants could root for them and express their own distinctiveness. The other important thing about a ballpark was it allowed them to root for the, quote, home team, and therefore declare, quite literally, that they were home.
If you're a fan of a particular team and you're with other fans, that overcomes your different ethnicities or your different class backgrounds. You can all rally around and be members of the same group. So it plays important community building functions as well.
And you could follow the home team in the local newspaper. America became a nation of newspapers because its new citizens did not share a common past. What immigrants shared were the immediate events of the present, the news. Aided by the inventions of the telephone, telegraph, and high-speed press, metropolitan newspapers doubled in number between 1870 and 1900. Savvy publishers like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were quick to pick up on the pulse of the nation.
Newspapers helped personalize an impersonal environment. In cities, you had millions of newcomers from literally all over the world, very often people that could not speak each other's languages. And what the metropolitan press, the newspapers, did was, through human interest stories, stories about romance, stories about crime, stories about other kinds of dramatic individual achievements and phenomena, was they made that environment personal. Somebody from England or somebody from Scandinavia or somebody from Romania, they could all look at the same newspaper and they could share in a single event.
The metropolitan press shortened the distance between diverse people and helped make them one people. The arrival of over 23 million immigrants to American shores coincided with revolutions in industry and technology. American work and culture were forever changed. So too were the immigrants. Their labor and spirit helped transform America into a global power. But for the immigrants, the American dream carried costs as well as opportunities. As they climbed America's ladder of success, they felt their children slipping out of their grasp. And they often felt oddly divided, caught uncomfortably between two worlds.
It was their children, of course, who went to school and who learned to speak English and who then functioned as a kind of translator between the family and the larger society. The children sort of had a foot in both worlds.
In 1929, Bulgarian immigrant Stoyan Christo began to look back on his life. What are we? Are we still what we were before we came to America? Or are we half Americans and half something else? In search of an answer, Christo would return to his native Bulgaria. But even there, he felt out of place. So he came back, once and for all, to the new nation that he now called home.
What joy upon my return to America. I felt like a child at the sight of his mother from whom it had been separated for months. Without unpacking my things, I walked for nearly 2 hours up and down Broadway like a man possessed. Everything that my eyes beheld, I felt like embracing with my arms. I cannot leave America.